Hello and welcome. I'm glad you're here. Whether you've had a long day or simply enjoy drifting off to history, tonight's journey is for you. We're going somewhere special. Get comfortable wherever you are. Let your body sink into rest. There's nothing you need to do right now. Just listen and let the story carry you. Imagine a city where bridges were neighborhoods, where streets twisted like a maze with no plan, no logic, where the sound of 100 church bells marked every hour, where night fell completely dark and the city transformed into something else entirely. This was Paris, but not the Paris you know, the Paris that locals saw, walked through, built with their own hands, a city that existed for centuries, and then quietly disappeared beneath the one we know today. Tonight, we'll walk those vanished streets together. We'll discover the island where it all began. Watch a cathedral rise over generations. Navigate the maze of medieval lanes. Experience the river that was everything. And understand what it meant to live in a city that's now only memory. Before we begin, if these journeys help you unwind, consider subscribing. It helps others find their way here too. Now, let's step back in time. Let's discover the Paris that disappeared. How do you build a city on an island barely larger than a few city blocks? The Seine River flows west through what is now the heart of Paris. For most of its length, it's a single broad channel. But in one particular place, the river splits around a narrow island of limestone and clay. An island roughly 800 meters long and 200 meters wide. This is the Azul de la Cité copyright. And this is where Paris began. Long before anyone called it Paris, this island was already ancient. The Parisii, a Celtic tribe, settled here sometime around the 3rd century BCE. They understood what made this location valuable. The island was defensible, surrounded by water, easy to protect. The river was shallow enough to ford in places, making it a natural crossing point for trade routes running north to south. Control the island, control the crossing. Control the crossing, control the trade. When the Romans arrived in the 1st century BCE, they saw the same advantages. Julius Caesar mentioned this place in his writings, calling it Lutetia. The Romans built in stone as Romans did everywhere. A small town emerged on the island. A forum, temple, administrative buildings. They expanded onto the left bank of the Seine, building an amphitheater that could seat 15,000 people, baths, and an aqueduct to bring fresh water from the hills. But the island remained the heart. Even as the Roman Empire extended its reach across Gaul, this modest river town stayed small. It was never a major Roman city like Lyon or Arles. Lutetia was a provincial outpost, useful for its position, but hardly grand. Then Rome began to fall. In the 3rd century CE, Germanic tribes started pushing across the Rhine. The left bank of the Seine, exposed and difficult to defend, was abandoned. The amphitheater fell silent. The baths crumbled. Everyone who remained retreated to the island. They pulled up the stones from the left bank and used them to build a wall around the Azul de la Cité copyright. The island became a fortress, small, fortified, isolated. By the 5th century, when the last vestiges of Roman authority collapsed, the island town had a new name. No longer Lutetia, but Paris, named for the Parisii who had lived here centuries before. The name stuck even as everything else changed. Imagine standing on that island in the year 500. You would see a small walled settlement, perhaps a few thousand people living within a space no larger than a modern neighborhood. The buildings would be modest, mostly wood and clay, though a few stone structures from Roman times still stood. The river surrounded you, constant and ever-present. To the north, across the narrower channel, scattered farms and vineyards. To the south, across the wider channel, abandoned ruins slowly disappearing beneath vegetation. The Seine itself was everything. It brought fish, carried trade goods. It provided water for drinking, washing, and every craft that needed it. But it also brought danger. The river flooded regularly. In wet years, the water would rise and spill over the low-lying edges of the island, turning streets into canals and driving residents to higher ground. Life on the island meant living with the water's rhythm. You learned to read the river. You knew when it would rise and when it would fall. You built accordingly, placing your home just high enough to avoid most floods, but not so high that you had to carry water uphill every day. 2 wooden bridges connected the island to the mainland. The Grand Pont to the north, the Petit Pont to the south. Both were simple structures, little more than timber pilings driven into the riverbed with planks laid across. They washed away in floods. They were rebuilt. They washed away again. This cycle repeated for centuries. And at the eastern tip of the island, the highest point, a church began to take shape. The original Cathedral of Paris. Not the Notre-Dame you might know, but its ancestor, a Merovingian structure, simple and solid. Christianity had taken root here. The island was becoming more than a fortress. It was becoming a sacred space. This was the foundation, a limestone island in a river, a people who had survived the collapse of an empire, a location that demanded resilience and adaptation. Everything that Paris would become started here, on this small island, surrounded by water, holding on. The locals who walked these streets could not have imagined what their city would become. They simply lived. They fished, traded, prayed, rebuilt after floods, and defended their walls when necessary. They were, by any measure, ordinary people making ordinary lives in an uncertain time. But they chose to stay. Generation after generation, they chose this island. And in that choice, in that persistence, something extraordinary began to grow. For almost 500 years, Paris remained what it had been since late Roman times, a fortified island town. This period, from roughly 500 to 1000 CE, was the long early medieval era. Paris existed, but it did not expand. It endured. The Merovingian kings who ruled Francia made Paris one of several capitals. Not the capital, but a capital. Kings moved from place to place, and when they came to Paris, they stayed on the island in the old royal palace near the western end. The palace was a modest complex of buildings, nothing like the grand structures that would come later. But it was royal, and that gave the island town a certain importance. Most of the island space was occupied by churches and monasteries. By the year 600, Paris had become primarily an ecclesiastical center. The cathedral dominated the eastern end. Several smaller churches filled the middle sections. A monastery dedicated to Saint Germain sat on the left bank across the Petit Pont. Religion shaped every aspect of daily life. The bells marked time, matins before dawn, prime at sunrise, terce at mid-morning. The hours of the day were measured by prayer, and the sound of bells calling the faithful echoed constantly across the small island. If you lived in Paris during these centuries, you oriented your entire existence around this sacred schedule. The population remained small. Perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 people lived on the island at any given time. Everyone knew everyone. There were no anonymous faces. When someone died, the whole community knew. When a child was born, everyone heard about it. This was a village, really. A village that happened to have a king and a cathedral. The streets were narrow paths between buildings. Not planned. Not organized. Buildings went up wherever there was space, and streets formed in the gaps between them. Some streets were barely wide enough for two people to pass. Most were unpaved, simply packed earth that turned to mud when it rained. In the center of the island, near where the Palais de Justice stands today, there was a marketplace. Small by later standards, but essential. Farmers from the surrounding countryside brought produce across the bridges. Fishermen brought their catch from the river. A few craftspeople had workshops, blacksmiths and potters mostly. The market operated every day except Sunday, filling the central square with voices, with the smell of fresh bread and river fish, with the sound of commerce conducted in early French that would sound strange to modern ears. Living on the island meant living with limitations. There was only so much space, only so much land for crops. The island produced almost nothing on its own. Everything had to come from somewhere else. Food from the fields to the north. Stone from quarries upriver. Timber from forests downstream. Paris was utterly dependent on its connections to the outside world. The river was both lifeline and threat. In most years, the Seine remained manageable. Boats moved up and down. The bridges held. But every few years, heavy rains would fall upstream, and the river would swell. The water would rise past the island's low edges and flood into homes and streets. People would move to upper floors if they had them, or simply wade through water until it subsided. Floods were part of life. Expected. Endured. Then came the Vikings. In 845, longships appeared on the Seine. Norse raiders had discovered that Francia's rivers were highways leading directly to its towns. They sailed up the Seine to Paris and demanded tribute. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, paid them to leave. They left. They returned. Again and again over the next decades, Viking fleets came up the river. The worst siege came in 885. 700 Viking ships, carrying perhaps 30,000 warriors, surrounded Paris. The island's population at that time was maybe 200 armed men. Everyone else, women, children, elderly, huddled behind the walls and prayed. The siege lasted nearly a year. The Vikings built siege towers. They tried to burn the wooden bridges. They catapulted stones and fire into the town. The defenders, led by Count Odo, held. They rebuilt what was destroyed. They fought from the walls. They refused to surrender. Eventually, Charles the Fat, who was now king, arrived with an army and negotiated with the Vikings. He paid them silver to leave. The siege ended not with military victory, but with money changing hands. The Vikings departed. Paris had survived. That siege changed something fundamental. The people of Paris realized they could not depend on distant kings to protect them. They had defended themselves. Count Odo, the man who led that defense, became king of West Francia within 2 years. Paris had proven itself. It was no longer just another fortified town. It was a place that stood firm when everything else collapsed. After the Viking threat faded, Paris settled back into its routines. The island remained small. The bridges were rebuilt. again. Life continued as it had for centuries. But something had shifted. Paris was beginning to matter. By the year 1000, the city was still just the island, still fortified, still dependent on the river. But it had endured invasions, floods, political chaos, and the collapse of empires. It had stood for 700 years on that small piece of limestone. And it was about to transform into something no one could have predicted. The locals who walked these streets in the year 1000 lived in a world their ancestors would have recognized. The same river, the same island, the same churches ringing their bells. They could not have known that within 2 centuries, their small island town would explode outward, that Paris would become a city unlike anything they could imagine. But the foundation was laid. In persistence, in resilience, in the simple fact of still being here. Something changed in the 11th century. Paris began to grow beyond the island. Not all at once, not according to any plan, but gradually, organically, people started building on the riverbanks. The right bank to the north was swampy and low-lying, but it had space. Merchants who needed more room than the crowded island could provide began constructing warehouses along the northern shore. Then workshops, then homes. A port district emerged, focused on the docks where boats unloaded goods coming from upstream and downstream. This area became known as the Grave, the riverbank. It was muddy, often flooded, and thoroughly commercial. The people who lived there were traders, boatmen, dock workers, craftsmen who needed access to river transport. It was noisy and crowded and smelled of fish and tar and wet rope. The island's elite looked down on it, both literally and figuratively. But it was where things got done. The left bank developed differently. The monastery of Saint Germain de Pra copyright S had been there for centuries, sitting on the southern shore surrounded by vineyards and fields. In the early 1100s, students began gathering there. Not in a formal university yet, just individual masters teaching small groups. But word spread. More students came. More teachers established themselves. By the mid-1100s, the left bank was becoming known for learning. The bridges connecting these growing districts to the island became more than just crossings. They became neighborhoods themselves. The Grand Pont, connecting the island to the right bank, was rebuilt in stone in the 1140s. Almost immediately, people started building houses on it. Not beside it. On it. Houses lined both sides of the bridge, creating a covered street over the water. Imagine walking across the Grand Pont in 1180. You would enter from the island through a gatehouse. Then you would walk between 3-story buildings, shops on the ground floor, living quarters above. Merchants sold goods from their doorways. Children played in the street. You could look between buildings and see the Seine flowing beneath. Feel the bridge sway slightly under the weight of so many structures. Then emerge on the right bank, where the market district sprawled outward in all directions. The same thing happened with the Petit Pont. Houses built directly on the bridge. Living quarters suspended over water. The bridges became some of the most desirable real estate in Paris. You were central, connected to everything, and you had unlimited water access directly beneath your home. Of course, the bridges also burned. Wood structures packed tightly together, cooking fires in every home, and the inevitable accident. The Grand Pont caught fire multiple times. Sometimes entire sections collapsed into the river. They were rebuilt, People moved back in. The cycle continued. As Paris expanded, the island remained the seat of power. The royal palace still occupied the western end. The cathedral still dominated the east. But the king was rarely there anymore. The Capetian dynasty, which had taken the throne in 987, preferred other residences. Paris was important, but it was one of many cities in the royal domain. The Bishop of Paris, however, was always there. The cathedral chapter, the priests and clergy who ran the cathedral, controlled significant property on the island. They collected rents. They administered justice in ecclesiastical courts. They ran schools for training new clergy. In many ways, the bishop was more powerful than the king in Paris itself. By 1150, Paris had perhaps 20,000 residents. Still small by the standards of Constantinople or Cordoba, but growing and changing. The tight little island community was becoming something more complex. Different districts developed different characters. The island remained religious and administrative. The right bank was mercantile and practical. The left bank was intellectual and ecclesiastical. If you lived in Paris during this time, your neighborhood defined much of your identity. The streets still had no formal names. You gave directions by landmarks. Past the church with the red door, turn where the baker has his sign, continue to the house with the painted shutters. Everyone knew the important buildings. The baker's oven, the well, the tavern. Navigation was personal and local. At night, the city transformed. There was no street lighting. None. When the sun set, Paris became nearly pitch black. People carried lanterns if they had to go out, but most simply stayed home. The darkness was absolute. And in that darkness, the city felt different. Smaller. More dangerous. Curfews were enforced. Gates closed. The night belonged to watchmen and priests going to midnight prayers. Then, in 1163, something extraordinary began. Bishop Maurice de Sully looked at the old cathedral and decided it was not grand enough for the growing city. Not impressive enough for God. He ordered it torn down. And in its place, they would build something that would take nearly 2 centuries to complete. Something that would define Paris forever. They would build Notre-Dame. The foundation stone was laid in 1163. Bishop Maurice de Sully blessed the site. King Louis VII was present. Pope Alexander III may have attended, though records are unclear. What is certain is that construction began on what would become the greatest church in France. For the people of Paris, watching Notre-Dame rise was a generations-long experience. If you were born in 1163, you might live to see the choir completed. Your children would see the nave built. Your grandchildren would watch the western towers take shape. The great rose window, the flying buttresses, the spire, all these would unfold over lifetimes. The construction site dominated the eastern end of the island. It was noise, constant noise. The ring of hammers on stone, the creak of wooden cranes, the shouts of workers coordinating lifts, carts rumbling over cobblestones bringing fresh stone from quarries southeast of the city. If you lived anywhere near the cathedral, the sound was your daily companion. The stones came from Charenton, a quarry about 12 kilometers away. Each block was cut roughly at the quarry, loaded onto carts, hauled to the Seine, transferred to barges, floated down to Paris, unloaded at the island's docks, then dragged to the construction site. Thousands of stones. Tens of thousands. The logistics were staggering. The skilled workers, the master masons and carvers, commanded high wages. They were artisans with specialized knowledge, and they knew their value. But most of the workers were laborers, men who carried stones, mixed mortar, hauled water, cleared rubble, boys who ran errands and learned the trade. Some worked for wages, others worked as penance, believing that their labor on God's house would earn them salvation. The cathedral rose in stages. First the choir, the eastern end where the altar would stand. This took about 20 years. Then the nave, the main body of the church stretching westward. Another 40 years. The western facade, with its twin towers and grand portal, came later still. As each section was completed, it was put into use. The choir was consecrated in 1182, even though most of the building remained unfinished. Masses were held amid construction. Weddings, funerals, baptisms, all conducted while work continued on the upper levels. The sound of hymns mixed with the sound of hammers, sacred and profane existing side by side. The scale was overwhelming. Notre-Dame was designed to hold 10,000 people. In a city of 20,000, that meant half the population could fit inside for major festivals. The ceiling soared 33 meters high. The towers would eventually reach 69 meters. For people who had never seen anything taller than a 3-story house, this was architecture from another realm. The stained glass was particularly revolutionary. Glass-making had improved dramatically in the 1100s. Craftsmen had learned how to create brilliant blues, deep reds, luminous golds. Notre Dame's windows told stories in light, biblical scenes, saints' lives, moral lessons. For a largely illiterate population, these windows were books, sermons made of colored glass. The great rose window on the western facade, 13 meters in diameter, was installed in the 1220s. It depicted the Virgin Mary surrounded by prophets and kings. When afternoon light struck that window, the entire western end of the cathedral blazed with color. Blue and red and gold pouring through the glass, falling across the stone floor like a benediction. Imagine being inside Notre Dame on a sunny afternoon in 1250. The nave is complete. The ceiling vaults overhead in perfect Gothic arches. Light streams through the windows, turning the air itself into color. The smell of incense hangs heavy. Voices echo, magnified by the stone. You are standing in a space specifically designed to make you feel small, to lift your eyes upward, to remind you that there are powers beyond human understanding. The cathedral changed Paris's relationship with itself. Before Notre Dame, the city was a commercial and administrative center. After Notre Dame began rising, Paris became something more, a pilgrimage destination, a seat of religious authority, a symbol of French Christianity. Kings were crowned here, councils were held, major religious relics were brought to be displayed. In 1239, Louis IX acquired what was believed to be the crown of thorns worn by Christ during the crucifixion. He walked barefoot through Paris carrying it to Notre Dame, where it was received with ceremony and placed in the cathedral treasury. Later, he would build Sainte-Chapelle specifically to house these holy relics. But their first home was Notre Dame. The cathedral's bells became the voice of the city. Emmanuel, the great Borden bell in the South Tower, weighed 13 tons. Its voice carried across all of Paris. When Emmanuel rang, everyone heard. It rang for royal births and deaths, for military victories, for major feast days, for danger, for celebration. The bell organized the city's emotional life. But construction never really ended. Even after the basic structure was complete by the mid-1200s, work continued. Chapels were added. The flying buttresses were reinforced. The spire was added in the 1200s, removed in the 1700s, rebuilt in the 1800s. Notre-Dame was never finished. It was always becoming. The locals who lived through its construction saw their city transform. What had been a modest island town with a simple cathedral became a city crowned by an architectural masterpiece. Pilgrims came from across Europe. Merchants followed the pilgrims. Scholars were drawn to the growing schools on the left bank. Paris was becoming a destination. And at the heart of it all, Notre Dame rose. Stone by stone, year by year, generation by generation. A monument to faith, to human ambition, to the belief that beauty could be built and that building it mattered. Medieval Paris had no street plan, no grid, no urban planning of any kind. Streets formed where people needed to walk. Buildings went up wherever there was space. The result was a labyrinth. If you could see Paris from above in the year 1200, you would see chaos. Streets that curved for no apparent reason. Dead ends that forced you to backtrack. Alleyways so narrow two people could barely pass. Some streets were wide enough for carts. Others were footpaths between buildings. There was no logic to it, just centuries of organic growth. The streets had names but not official ones. Locals gave them descriptive titles. The street of the roasted goose. The street where the baker had the red sign. The muddy lane. The street that goes to the fish market. These names were practical based on whoever lived there or whatever happened there. When the roasted goose seller moved away, the name might change. Or it might not. There was no consistency. Most streets were simply called Rue, the road. Not Rue de something, just Rue. If you needed to be more specific, you described the destination. The Rue that goes to the cathedral. The Rue near the palace. Outsiders got lost constantly. Locals never did. Walking through these streets meant navigating a sensory overload. Let's walk together through a typical route from the Azel de la Cité copyright across the Grand Pont to the Right Bank Market District on a morning in 1250. You start at the Cathedral Square, the open space in front of Notre Dame. It's crowded even early in the morning. Pilgrims waiting for the church to open. Beggars calling for alms. Street vendors selling bread, cheese, small beer. The air smells of unwashed bodies and baking bread and the slight sewage odor that pervades the island. You head west along the main street. This is one of the wider streets, perhaps 4 meters across. Buildings press in on both sides, 3 and 4 stories tall. Each upper floor juts out slightly farther than the one below, so the tops of the buildings nearly touch overhead. This creates a tunnel effect. You walk in perpetual shade, even on sunny days. The ground beneath your feet is mostly packed earth, though someone has laid irregular cobblestones in the center channel. The edges are muddy. There's no drainage system. Water from rain, from washing, from various less pleasant sources simply flows along the street until it reaches the river. You step carefully, trying to avoid the worst puddles. As you walk, you pass shops. The ground floor of most buildings is commercial. A baker with his oven built into the side of his house, heat radiating out. cobbler working leather in his doorway, a wine merchant with barrels stacked outside. Each shop has a sign, not words most people can't read. Pictures. Painted boot for the cobbler, a painted cup for the tavern. You navigate by these symbols. The noise is constant, people calling out their wares. Fresh bread, still warm. Wine from Burgundy. Cloth, fine cloth. Conversations in doorways. Children playing. Dogs barking. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rings the hour. The sound bounces between the narrow walls, echoing, making it hard to tell which church it comes from. You reach the Grand Pont. Here the street widens slightly before narrowing again onto the bridge itself. The bridge is completely built over. Houses and shops line both sides. You walk through what feels like an indoor street, except you can see water through the gaps between buildings. The bridge sways slightly. You can feel it move under the weight of traffic. This is normal, slightly unnerving if you're not used to it. The shops on the bridge specialize in luxury goods. Goldsmiths, money changers, jewelers. The rent here is higher because the location is premium. You're literally at the center of Paris, the crossing point everyone uses. Prime retail space even in 1250. You emerge from the bridge onto the right bank. Immediately the character changes. The island felt cramped and religious. The right bank feels open and commercial. The street widens into a plaza. This is the Grave, the main port and market area. Boats line the riverbank, unloading cargo. The market spreads out in every direction. Here the smells intensify. Fish, fresh and drying. Spices from boats that have traveled far upriver. Tar from the shipwrights. Animals because people are buying and selling chickens, geese, sometimes pigs. The air is thick with commerce. From here, streets radiate outward in all directions. Each street tends to specialize. There's a street where butchers cluster. The smell of blood and meat is overwhelming there. Another street for cloth merchants, where vendors display woolens and linens hanging from hooks. Another for metalworkers, where the ring of hammers echoes all day. This clustering isn't planned. It happens because similar trades naturally group together. Butchers share suppliers and tools. Cloth merchants benefit from customers comparing prices. Once a street becomes known for a trade, more practitioners of that trade move there. Eventually, the street gets a name based on its specialty. If you venture deeper into the right bank, the streets become even more tangled. Residential areas where houses are packed tightly together. Streets that are barely more than passages. You walk single file. You can reach out and touch both walls. Above you, the upper floors nearly meet, blocking out most light. These are the poorest districts, where day laborers and servants rent tiny rooms. The buildings lean at odd angles. Nothing is quite square or level. Getting lost is easy. Even long-time residents sometimes take wrong turns. There are no maps, no street signs, just memory and local knowledge. You learn your neighborhood intimately. The rest of the city remains somewhat mysterious. This maze-like quality wasn't a bug. It was the result of hundreds of years of people making individual decisions about where to build. No one planned it. No one could see the whole picture. Each building, each street, each district emerged organically from thousands of small choices. The result was uniquely medieval, irrational, inefficient, and somehow it worked. The locals who navigated these streets every day didn't think of them as a maze. They thought of them as home. Each twist and turn was familiar. Each landmark was known. The baker's red sign, the well in the square, the church with the crooked spire. These were the points that mapped their world. It would all disappear. In the 1800s, Baron Haussmann would tear down most of medieval Paris and replace it with broad boulevards and regular blocks. But for 600 years, this labyrinth was Paris. Twisted, organic, alive with the accumulated decisions of generations. The Seine divided Paris. But more importantly, it connected Paris to the world. Everything came by water. Food from the surrounding countryside floated down on barges. Building stone from quarries upstream arrived by boat. Timber from forests to the east was lashed into rafts and guided downstream. Wine from Burgundy. Salt from the Atlantic coast. Even fish caught dozens of kilometers away. The river was Paris's supply line. The river trades were controlled by guilds. The Watermen's Guild, the Marchands de l'eau, was the most powerful. They controlled all commerce on the Seine within Paris. If you wanted to transport goods by water, you dealt with them. They set prices. They regulated who could operate boats. They collected fees. Their wealth was immense. The guild's symbol was a ship. It appeared on their seal, on their meeting hall, eventually on the city's coat of arms. The motto Fluctuat nec mergitur, she is tossed by waves but does not sink, referred to that ship. The Watermen's Guild essentially ran Paris's economy. Kings came and went. The watermen remained. The riverbank was perpetual activity. Boats arriving, unloading, departing. Workers hauling cargo from docks to warehouses. Animals being led off boats. The Grave, the main port on the right bank, operated from dawn until well after dark. Torches lit the work when daylight faded. The labor never truly stopped. Different types of boats served different purposes. Heavy barges for bulk goods. Smaller craft for passengers. Fishing boats, recognizable by their nets. Ferry boats that shuttled people across the river for a small fee. The Seine was crowded with traffic. Boats constantly maneuvering, avoiding each other, competing for dock space. Fishing was a major industry. The Seine teemed with fish. Pike, perch, salmon, eels. Fishermen worked the river in shifts, day and night. Their catches went to market immediately, sold fresh that morning or evening. Fish that didn't sell were salted or dried for storage. Nothing was wasted. The river also provided water, though not for drinking directly. The Seine was too polluted for that, full of waste from the city. Water carriers made their living hauling fresh water from springs and wells to households that could afford it. But the river water was used for everything else. Washing clothes, washing dishes, tanning leather, dyeing cloth. Any craft that needed water drew it from the Seine. Laundresses worked at designated spots along the banks. They scrubbed clothes against flat stones, using the river's current to rinse away soap. It was backbreaking work. They stood in the shallows for hours, hands in cold water, beating and wringing heavy wet fabric. But it was steady work. Everyone needed clean clothes, and not everyone could do their own washing. The bridges were where the city's life intersected with the river most dramatically. Water mills were anchored to the bridge pilings. The river's current turned the wheels, which powered millstones for grinding grain. The sound of these mills was constant, a deep rhythmic rumbling, the creaking of wood, the splash of water. If you lived on or near the bridges, this was your soundscape. Day and night, the mills turned. Paris had dozens of these mills by the 1200s. They ground wheat into flour, crushed malt for beer, powered saws for cutting timber. The mills represented technology at work, harnessing the river's natural power for human purposes. They were also owned by powerful interests, usually monasteries or wealthy merchants, who collected fees from anyone who needed grain milled. The river's level changed with the seasons. In spring, when snow melted in the watershed far upstream, the Seine swelled. Sometimes it flooded. The low-lying areas of the right bank would go underwater. Streets became canals. Ground floors filled with water. People adapted. They moved belongings upstairs. They waited. The water always receded eventually. Major floods were disasters. In 1206, the Seine rose so high it destroyed the Grand Pont entirely. All the houses built on it collapsed into the river. People drowned. Goods were lost. The bridge was rebuilt. People moved back. The cycle continued. In summer, the river could sink low. The mills slowed or stopped when the current weakened. Boats struggled to navigate shallower channels. The city's supply system strained. But these were rare years. Usually, the Seine provided reliably. The river had a rhythm, and Paris moved to that rhythm. Boats arriving with the morning. Markets opening as cargo was unloaded. Ferries running back and forth all day. The mills grinding continuously. Fishermen checking their lines at dusk. The river organized time. Even now, as you rest, you can imagine that sound. The gentle, constant flow of water. The creak of boats against docks. The splash of oars. For the people of medieval Paris, the river was not scenery. It was not something to admire from a distance. It was life itself, the artery that fed the city, the boundary that defined its shape, the force that turned mills and carried commerce and connected Paris to the wider world. Without the Seine, there would have been no Paris. It was that simple. The river gave the city everything, and the city, in turn, shaped itself around the river's presence. The economy of medieval Paris was not free. It was controlled, regulated, organized into guilds that governed every aspect of production and trade. A guild was an association of craftsmen or merchants in the same trade. Bakers had a guild. Butchers had a guild. Goldsmiths, weavers, tanners, wine merchants, each trade had its own guild. These organizations controlled who could practice the trade, how products were made, what prices could be charged, and how apprentices were trained. To work in a trade, you had to belong to its guild. You couldn't simply open a bakery or start selling cloth. You had to serve years as an apprentice, learning the craft. Then years as a journeyman working for wages. Only after proving your skill and paying substantial fees could you become a master and open your own shop. The guilds protected their members from competition. They also maintained quality standards. Guild inspectors could seize and destroy substandard work. Les Halles, the central market, was the beating heart of Parisian commerce. Located on the right bank, it sprawled across several streets and squares. The name meant the halls, but it was much more than covered buildings. It was a vast open-air market that operated 6 days a week, closed only on Sundays. Walking through less alleys on a market day was an assault on the senses. Vendors calling out their wares in voices hoarse from shouting. Fresh eggs, carrots, turnips, onions, cheese from Normandy. The smell of bread from a dozen bakeries mingling with the sharper odors of fish, meat, and unwashed humanity pressed close together. The market was organized by product. Produce sellers clustered in one area, butchers in another, fish vendors near the river for easy access to fresh catch. This wasn't legally mandated. It happened naturally because similar vendors competed for the same customers, and customers appreciated being able to compare offerings. The butcher's section was particularly dramatic. Whole carcasses hung from hooks. Butchers worked in the open, cutting meat on wooden blocks. Blood ran in channels through the street toward the river. The smell was intense, especially in summer. But meat was a luxury for most Parisians, something purchased for special occasions or feast days. The Butchers' Guild was wealthy and powerful. The Bakers' Guild was perhaps the most essential. Bread was the foundation of the medieval diet. Most Parisians ate bread with every meal. A loaf in the morning dipped in soup or beer. Bread again at midday, perhaps with cheese. More bread in the evening. When bread prices rose or quality fell, riots could follow. The Bakers' Guild regulated everything about bread production. The weight of loaves. The price per loaf, which varied with grain prices. The hours when bread could be sold. Guild inspectors patrolled the markets with scales, checking that bakers weren't shortchanging customers. Cheating meant fines or expulsion from the guild. Repeat offenders could be banned from practicing their trade. Some guilds were more exclusive than others. The Goldsmiths' Guild was small and elite. Working with precious metals required not only skill but capital. Guild membership was often hereditary, passed from father to son. The Goldsmith Street, where their workshops clustered, was one of the wealthiest in Paris. Women participated in some guilds but not others. There were female silk workers, embroiderers, and makers of head coverings. Some women inherited guild membership from their husbands and continued operating workshops after being widowed. But most guilds were male-dominated. The idea of a woman master butcher or blacksmith was nearly unthinkable. Market days brought people from the surrounding countryside. Farmers with vegetables, eggs, chickens. Women with butter and cheese. Charcoal burners with fuel for heating. These country vendors were not guild members. They operated under different rules, paying fees for market stalls but not subject to the same regulations as city craftsmen. The market was also where you heard news. Rumors spread quickly in the crowded aisles. Who had died? What the king was doing? Whether harvest looked good this year? Stories from travelers who had been to distant cities. The market was Paris's newspaper, its social media, its information network. Prices fluctuated with supply. After a good harvest, grain was cheap and bread plentiful. After a poor harvest, prices soared and people went hungry. The guilds tried to maintain stable prices, but they couldn't control the weather or the crops. Famine years were regular occurrences. People learned to endure scarcity. The city government, such as it was, concerned itself primarily with market regulation, making sure weights and measures were honest, ensuring food safety at least crudely, settling disputes between buyers and sellers. A whole bureaucracy existed just to keep the markets functioning. Shopping for food was a daily activity. There was no refrigeration. Most homes had no way to store fresh food for more than a day. So every morning, someone from each household went to market, bought bread, perhaps some vegetables, maybe fish if affordable, carried it home, prepared it immediately. Life revolved around this daily procurement of food. For the wealthy, servants did this work. But for most Parisians, market days meant navigating the crowds yourself, haggling over prices, judging the quality of produce, comparing offerings from different vendors. It was social, communal, exhausting, and absolutely necessary. The guilds gave structure to economic life. They created stability, predictability, and quality control. They also created rigidity. Innovation was difficult when every change had to be approved by guild authorities. Outsiders couldn't break in. But for those within the system, guild membership meant security, a place in the social order, protection from unscrupulous competition. This system would last for centuries. The guilds controlled Paris's economy well into the 1700s. But in the medieval period, they were at their height, powerful, wealthy, and deeply woven into the fabric of daily life. While the right bank bustled with commerce, the left bank cultivated minds. In the early 1100s, teachers began gathering on the left bank, not in a formal institution, but as individual masters offering instruction. Students, mostly young men training for careers in the church, came to study under these masters. They learned grammar, rhetoric, logic. They studied theology and philosophy. They lived in cramped boarding houses and spent their days in discussion and debate. This informal arrangement gradually organized itself. By the mid-1100s, teachers and students formed associations for mutual protection and regulation. They called themselves a universitas, a corporation, or guild. The University of Paris was born, not by royal charter or ecclesiastical decree, but by the simple decision of scholars to band together. The university wasn't a place at first. It was a community. Classes met wherever space could be found. In churches, in rented rooms, in the open air when weather permitted. Students sat on straw on the floor while the master lectured from a chair. Sometimes hundreds of students attended a single master's lectures. The language of instruction was Latin, always Latin. This had practical advantages. Students came from across Europe. Germans, English, Italians, Scots. They didn't share a common spoken language, but they all learned Latin. The left bank became known as the Latin Quarter because Latin was all you heard there. Student life was chaotic. Young men, teenagers mostly, far from home for the first time, living in a foreign city with minimal supervision. They studied, yes, but they also drank, fought, and caused trouble. Taverns near the university did brisk business. Fights between students and townspeople were common. The city watch regularly had to break up brawls. The university claimed special privileges. Students and masters were exempt from city law. If a student committed a crime, he was tried in ecclesiastical courts, not civil ones. This created resentment. Parisians felt that students got away with behavior that would land townspeople in prison. Tensions between town and gown were constant. In 1229, these tensions exploded. A riot started during carnival season. Students were drinking in a tavern, got into an argument with the innkeeper over the bill, and things escalated. The city watch arrived and several students were beaten. The next day, students retaliated, smashing taverns and attacking townspeople. The king's forces intervened. Several students were killed. The university went on strike. Masters and students simply left Paris. They dispersed to other cities, taking their teaching elsewhere. This was the university's ultimate weapon. Without the university, Paris lost prestige and revenue. The strike lasted 2 years. Finally, the Pope intervened, forcing the king to grant the university greater autonomy and protections. The scholars returned. The university had won. The curriculum was rigorous. Students began with the arts faculty, studying the trivium and quadrivium. The trivium: grammar, rhetoric, logic. The quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. This foundational education took years. Only after completing it could students move to advanced study in theology, law, or medicine. Theological debates could become passionate. The great questions of the age were argued in these lecture halls. How do faith and reason relate? Can Aristotle's philosophy be reconciled with Christian doctrine? What is the nature of the Eucharist? These weren't abstract puzzles. They were matters that could get you declared a heretic. Thomas Aquinas taught at Paris in the 1260s and 1270s. His lectures drew enormous crowds. He argued that reason and revelation were compatible, that Aristotelian logic could illuminate Christian truth. This was controversial. Some of his ideas were condemned by church authorities. But his synthesis of philosophy and theology would eventually become foundational to Catholic thought. Books were precious commodities. Every book was copied by hand. A single Bible could take months to produce and cost as much as a house. Most students couldn't afford books. They took notes during lectures, memorized what they could, and borrowed texts when possible. A system of book rental developed. Stationers held exemplar copies that could be rented out in sections, called pici, for students to copy. The university attracted the brightest minds in Europe. It became the intellectual center of Christendom. To study at Paris was to be at the forefront of learning. The university's reputation drew students and masters from every corner of the continent. Paris was where ideas collided, where orthodoxy was tested, where the future of Western thought was being shaped. But it was also a place of young men living in poverty, studying by candlelight, arguing in taverns, occasionally rioting, always debating. The Latin Quarter was intellectual ferment mixed with youthful chaos. Brilliant and messy in equal measure. The locals who lived near the university had complicated feelings about it. The students brought commerce. They rented rooms, bought food, patronized taverns. But they also caused noise, fights, and damage. They were privileged foreigners who didn't have to follow the same rules as everyone else. Resentment and dependence existed side by side. Still, the university gave the left bank its character. It was the intellectual district, the place of books and ideas. While the right bank counted money, the left bank counted arguments. Both were essential to what Paris was becoming. Not all of Paris was crowded markets and student lodgings. Some areas were quiet, elegant, reserved for those with means. The nobility who maintained residences in Paris built town houses, called hôtels, that were miniature estates. These weren't hotels in the modern sense. They were large houses with courtyards, gardens, and multiple buildings. The Marais district on the right bank became particularly fashionable in the 1300s and 1400s. A noble's hotel was built around a courtyard. You entered through a gate from the street, passing into a private world separate from the chaos outside. The main residence faced the courtyard. Stables and service buildings lined the sides. Behind, if space allowed, a garden. Some had fountains. Some had orchards. These were oases of calm in a noisy city. The architecture was stone, not timber like most Paris buildings. Stone was expensive but didn't burn. Fire was a constant threat in medieval Paris, and the wealthy took precautions the poor couldn't afford. Stone walls, tile roofs instead of thatch, separate kitchens to keep cooking fires away from living quarters. Inside, the rooms were decorated with tapestries. Tapestries served multiple purposes. They covered cold stone walls, making rooms warmer. They displayed wealth, as fine tapestries were enormously expensive. And they told stories, depicting biblical scenes, classical myths, or contemporary events. A great hall hung with tapestries made a statement about the owner's taste and resources. Furniture was surprisingly sparse by modern standards. Even wealthy homes had relatively few pieces. A bed, massive and canopied, was the most important furnishing. Chests for storage. A table, often just boards laid across trestles. Chairs were rare. Most people sat on benches or cushions on the floor. A chair was a symbol of authority. The head of the household sat in the chair. Everyone else found other seats. Heating was a challenge. Stone buildings were cold. Fireplaces helped, but they were inefficient. Most heat went up the chimney. People dressed in layers indoors. They used bed curtains to trap warmth at night. In deep winter, even the wealthy were cold. They just had better ways of managing it than the poor did. Wealthy households had servants. Many servants. A modest, noble household might employ a dozen people. A great household could have 50 or more. Cooks, stable hands, messengers, laundresses, chambermaids, stewards to manage the property, tutors for children. These servants lived in the same house, usually in upper floors or separate buildings. Their lives were bound to the household they served. Meals in wealthy houses were elaborate affairs. Multiple courses. Exotic spices imported at great cost. Meat at nearly every meal roasted or in pies. Wine instead of water or beer. Fresh fruit, a luxury in winter. The wealthy ate well, even extravagantly, while most of Paris subsisted on bread and soup. Fashion was another marker of class. Sumptuary laws tried to regulate who could wear what. Certain colors were reserved for nobles. Certain fabrics forbidden to commoners. Fur trim, silk, fine wool, these marked you as someone of status. People could recognize your place in society at a glance, just by what you wore. The wealthy also had access to private chapels. Instead of going to the parish church with everyone else, they could hear Mass in their own homes. They hired chaplains to serve these private chapels. This was both convenience and status symbol. It set them apart spiritually as well as materially. Gardens were particularly valued. A walled garden behind your hotel was a retreat. Roses, herbs, fruit trees. A place to walk in privacy. A place for contemplation or conversation away from the household's bustle. These gardens were carefully tended by specialized servants who knew how to coax growth from urban soil. But even the wealthy dealt with urban realities. Their streets still filled with mud when it rained. Waste disposal was still primitive. Noise from the city penetrated their courtyards. They had more comfort, more space, more privacy than most Parisians. But they were still living in a medieval city. They couldn't escape it entirely. The gap between rich and poor was visible in everything. Housing, clothing, food, access to education, legal protections. The wealthy lived in a different Paris than the poor did. Sometimes those two Paris existed on the same street, separated only by walls and gates. Inside the telephones, comfort and elegance. Outside, the crowded, muddy, noisy reality of urban life. This division was accepted as natural. The social order was believed to be ordained by God. Some people were born to rule and others to serve. That was simply how the world worked. The idea that things could be different, that society could be organized on egalitarian principles, was almost unthinkable. Still, the wealthy depended on the poor. Someone had to grow the food, bake the bread, sew the clothes, build the houses. The elegant telephones of the Marais existed because of the labor of thousands of ordinary Parisians. The relationship was hierarchical, but it was also symbiotic. Paris couldn't function without both. Paris needed walls. In a world of war, invasion, and banditry, a city without walls was a city at risk. The first substantial walls were built under King Philip Augustus in the late 1100s and early 1200s. By this time, Paris had spread far beyond the island. The right and left banks needed protection. Philip ordered construction of stone walls that would enclose the entire city. The right bank wall was built first, completed around 1210. It ran in a rough semicircle from the Seine, enclosing the commercial districts, then back to the river. The left bank wall came next, enclosing the university quarter and the growing residential areas. These walls were substantial, 3 meters thick, 10 meters high, built to withstand siege engines. The walls had gates, points where roads entered the city. Each gate was fortified with towers and could be sealed with heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron. The gates opened at dawn and closed at dusk. Once closed, no one entered or left until morning. If you were outside when the gates closed, you spent the night there. This wasn't symbolic. It was absolute. The walls kept Paris sealed. Guards manned the gates during operating hours. They collected tolls on goods entering the city. Merchants bringing wine, grain, cloth, livestock, all paid entry fees. These tolls were a major source of royal revenue. They also made prices inside Paris higher than in the surrounding countryside. Everything cost more once it passed through the gates. The walls defined who was Parisian and who was not. Inside the walls, you were under city law. Outside, you were in the domain of various nobles who controlled the surrounding lands. The walls created a legal boundary as well as a physical one. But walls also constrained growth. Land inside the walls was limited. As Paris's population grew, the city became more crowded. Buildings went up higher. Streets became more congested. Every square meter was valuable. Some people built outside the walls in suburbs called faubourgs, but these areas lacked the protection walls provided. In times of war, suburban residents had to flee inside the walls or risk being caught in the fighting. The walls also served as the foundation for buildings. Houses were built against the inside of the wall, using it as one of their exterior walls. This was practical but also weakened the wall's defensive value. If enemies took a house built against the wall, they had easy access to the top. City authorities periodically ordered these buildings removed. People ignored the orders and rebuilt. The tension between defense and habitation was constant. Philip Augustus also built a fortress, the Louvre, at the western edge of the right bank walls. This was not a palace, not yet. It was a military stronghold, a massive keep designed to anchor the city's defenses. Thick walls, deep moat, defensible towers. The Louvre protected Paris from attack from the west and also served as a symbol of royal power. Walking along the top of the walls was possible, and people did. The walls provided a path around the entire city. From up there, you could see over the rooftops, get a sense of the city's layout. You could also see outward to the fields and forests beyond. The walls gave Parisians an elevated perspective on their home. In peacetime, the walls were background. People went about their lives, barely thinking about them. But in times of threat, the walls became everything. They were what stood between the city and destruction. During the 100 Years' War, when English armies threatened Paris repeatedly, the walls were all that kept the city safe. Maintaining the walls was expensive. Stone crumbled. Gates needed repair. Moats filled with silt and garbage. The city had to constantly invest in upkeep. Special taxes funded wall maintenance. Compulsory labor sometimes required residents to work on repairs. By the 1300s, Paris had outgrown even Philip Augustus's walls. New suburbs sprawled beyond the gates. In the 1370s, during the 100 Years' War, Charles V ordered construction of new walls on the right bank, enclosing a much larger area. These walls pushed the boundary outward, protecting the suburbs that had developed. The city grew in stages, each marked by a new ring of walls. The walls shaped how Paris developed. They forced the city to grow vertically when it couldn't expand horizontally. They created distinct inside and outside zones. They made Paris defensible but also constrained. The walls were security and limitation, protection and prison all at once. For the locals who lived within them, the walls were simply part of life. You knew where the gates were. You knew when they closed. You knew the rhythms of the city's opening and sealing. The walls weren't oppressive. They were just how cities worked. How you knew you were home. To understand medieval Paris, you must understand that religion wasn't something people did on Sundays. It was woven into every aspect of existence. The day was structured by church bells. Every few hours, bells rang across the city, calling the faithful to prayer. Matins before dawn, prime at sunrise, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in mid-afternoon, vespers at sunset, compline before bed. Most people didn't attend all these services, but they heard the bells. They knew what time it was by which bells rang. The calendar was organized around saints' days and religious festivals. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, everyone knew these. But there were dozens of other holy days throughout the year. Saints' feast days when you didn't work. Days of fasting when you ate only bread and vegetables. Days of celebration with special foods and processions. The rhythm of the year was religious. Churches were everywhere. Paris had dozens of parish churches, each serving a particular neighborhood. Your parish church was where you were baptized, married, and eventually memorialized after death. It was your spiritual home. The parish priest knew your family. He heard your confessions. He administered last rites when death approached. You paid him tithes, a portion of your income to support the church. Beyond parish churches, there were monasteries, communities of monks or nuns living according to religious rules. These monasteries often owned substantial property in Paris. They ran hospitals, schools, workshops. They were economic as well as spiritual institutions. The Abbey of Saint-Germain-de-Prés copyright S controlled much of the left bank. The Abbey of Saint-Geneviève dominated the hilltop to the south. Relics were treated with enormous reverence. A saint's bone, a piece of the true cross, anything that had touched a holy person, these were precious beyond gold. Churches competed to acquire relics. Relics attracted pilgrims. Pilgrims brought donations. A church with powerful relics could become wealthy. Pilgrimage was a regular feature of religious life. People made journeys to visit holy sites, sometimes traveling for weeks or months. Paris itself was a pilgrimage destination because of Notre-Dame and the relics housed in Sainte-Chapelle. The city's inns filled with pilgrims. Vendors sold badges and tokens as souvenirs. Pilgrimage was devotion, but it was also tourism and commerce. Sin and salvation preoccupied people. The medieval church taught that everyone was born in sin. Your actions in life determined whether you went to heaven or hell. And the church controlled access to salvation. Through the sacraments, baptism, confession, communion, marriage, last rites, the church mediated your relationship with God. You couldn't bypass it. Salvation required the church. Confession was mandatory at least once a year. You knelt before your priest and admitted your sins. He assigned penance, prayers, or acts of charity you had to perform to be forgiven. This gave priests enormous power. They knew everyone's secrets. They could withhold absolution, leaving you in a state of sin. The threat of being cut off from the sacraments was terrifying. Excommunication was the ultimate penalty. If the church excommunicated you, you were spiritually dead. No sacraments. No Christian burial. Your soul condemned to hell. And social consequences followed. An excommunicate person was shunned. No one would do business with them. Friends and family might cut ties. Excommunication could destroy your life. Religious imagery filled public space. Crosses at crossroads. Statues of Mary on building corners. Biblical scenes carved into church portals. You couldn't walk through Paris without encountering constant reminders of faith. The city was a physical catechism, teaching doctrine through architecture and art. Miracles were believed to happen regularly. A sick person prayed to a saint and recovered. That was a miracle. A building survived a fire when everything around it burned. That was divine protection. The church investigated reported miracles. If verified, they became evidence of God's continuing presence in the world. Skepticism existed, but it was quietly held. Publicly doubting miracles could be dangerous. Heresy was a serious threat. Questioning church doctrine, even slightly, could lead to accusations of heresy. And heretics could be executed, burned at the stake in public. The church was not tolerant of dissent. Conformity was expected. Deviation was perilous. But faith also provided comfort. In a world of uncertainty, disease, early death, and hardship, religion offered explanations. Suffering had meaning. Death was not the end. The poor might be miserable now, but heaven awaited. This life was temporary. The next life was eternal. That belief helped people endure. For the people of medieval Paris, faith wasn't optional. It was as fundamental as breathing. You were Christian. You attended church. You observed holy days. You confessed your sins. Not because you consciously chose to, but because that was simply what everyone did. It was the foundation everything else was built on. Medieval Paris after dark was a different city entirely. There were no street lights, none at all. When the sun set, the city plunged into near total darkness. The moon provided some light on clear nights, but on cloudy nights or during the new moon, the darkness was absolute. People who had to go out after dark carried lanterns. These were simple devices, usually a candle enclosed in a metal and horn frame. The light they provided was dim. You could see perhaps a few meters ahead. Enough not to trip. Not enough to see clearly. Walking at night meant moving slowly, cautiously, aware that every shadow could hide danger. Most people simply didn't go out after dark. They stayed home. Shutters closed against the night. Doors barred. Maybe a fire in the hearth if you could afford fuel. Candlelight if you had candles. Otherwise, you sat in darkness. Talked. Told stories. Went to bed early because there was nothing else to do. The city gates closed at sunset. Guards sealed them. No one entered or left until dawn. This turned Paris into an island of sorts, cut off from the outside world, sealed in darkness. The night belonged to those already inside. A curfew operated unofficially. Respectable people stayed home. Those out after dark were assumed to be up to no good. The city watch patrolled, such as it was. They stopped anyone they encountered and demanded to know their business. If you couldn't give a good reason for being out, you might be arrested. Or beaten. The watch wasn't gentle. Crime increased at night. The darkness provided cover. Thieves operated more boldly. Assaults happened in dark streets. Murder was easier when no one could see. The wealthy who had to travel at night hired guards to accompany them. The poor took their chances. Taverns stayed open after dark. These were some of the few public spaces with light and warmth. Men gathered to drink, gamble, socialize. Women sometimes worked in taverns as servers or prostitutes. Taverns had a rough reputation. Fights broke out regularly. The drunk staggered home through dark streets at dangerous hours. But for many, taverns were the only social outlet available. Brothels operated openly in certain districts. Medieval society didn't pretend prostitution didn't exist. It was regulated. Certain streets were designated for brothels. The women who worked there were registered. They paid taxes. Church authorities condemned prostitution as sinful but accepted it as inevitable. Better to regulate it than pretend it wasn't happening. Night sounds were different from day sounds. The constant noise of commerce faded. Church bells still rang the hours. Dogs barked. Occasionally you'd hear shouting, fighting, or singing from taverns. But mostly the city was quieter. The silence itself could be unnerving if you were used to the daytime bustle. Fire was a particular danger at night. A candle knocked over. Embers escaping a hearth. A cooking fire left unattended. In a city of timber buildings packed tightly together, fire could spread catastrophically fast. At night, when everyone was asleep, a fire could engulf whole neighborhoods before anyone noticed. The night watch was supposed to watch for fires, but they were few and the city was large. Some people had to work at night. Bakers started their ovens in the pre-dawn hours so bread would be ready when the city woke. Night soil collectors emptied privies under cover of darkness. Guards on the walls kept watch. Priests rose for midnight prayers. These nocturnal workers moved through a Paris that was foreign even to longtime residents. The wealthy in their hot telephones had more light than most. They could afford many candles. Their houses had multiple fireplaces. They might sit up late, reading if they were literate, entertaining guests, conducting business. But even they were constrained by darkness. Candlelight was weak. Reading by it strained the eyes. Most activities were simply easier during daylight. So even the wealthy mostly followed the sun's rhythm. Winter nights were longest and hardest. The sun set early. The darkness lasted 16 hours or more. Cold and dark combined. Fuel was expensive. Many people couldn't afford to keep fires burning all night. They huddled under blankets and waited for dawn. When sunrise finally came, it was relief. The city woke. Gates opened. Shops opened. People emerged into streets that were suddenly navigable again. Light meant safety. It meant warmth. It meant life could resume. The locals who lived through these cycles of light and dark thought nothing unusual about them. This was simply how life worked. Darkness came every night. You adapted. You planned around it. You learned to navigate by feel. And you appreciated daylight in a way difficult for modern people to understand. The night city, dangerous and dark, was as much a part of medieval Paris as the day city. You just experienced it differently. With caution, with wariness, and with gratitude when morning came again. In the autumn of 1348, death came to Paris. The plague had been moving across Europe for months. It had started in the east, traveled trade routes westward, and now reached France. Paris couldn't escape. Too many people. Too crowded. Too connected to the wider world. The disease found ideal conditions. No one understood how plague spread. They didn't know about rats or fleas or bacteria. To them, it seemed to appear randomly. One person would sicken, then their family, then neighbors. Within days, everyone on a street might be ill. The symptoms were terrible. Fever, chills, weakness, painful swellings in the neck, armpits, groin. These buboes gave the disease its name, bubonic plague. Some people died within days. Others lingered longer. Very few recovered once symptoms appeared. The death toll was staggering. Paris, which had perhaps 200,000 residents before the plague, lost perhaps half its population. Estimates vary. Record-keeping broke down as so many died. But the scale was catastrophic. Entire families wiped out. Streets emptied. Businesses shuttered. The churches couldn't keep up with burials. Normally, each person received individual rites. A proper funeral. Burial in consecrated ground. But when hundreds died each day, this became impossible. Mass graves were dug. Bodies were simply stacked in pits. The spiritual comfort of proper burial was lost in the overwhelming need to dispose of corpses. People responded with fear and confusion. Some believed God was punishing humanity for its sins. They joined processions of flagellants, groups that whipped themselves publicly as penance. Others blamed Jews, falsely accusing them of poisoning wells. This led to terrible violence. Jewish communities were attacked. People murdered based on paranoid rumors. Fear breeds cruelty. Some tried to flee. The wealthy left Paris for country estates, hoping distance from the city would protect them. Sometimes it did. Often it didn't. The plague spread to villages and manors. Geography provided no guaranteed safety. Those who stayed adapted as best they could, avoiding crowds when possible, burning herbs to purify the air, believing bad smells caused illness, carrying flowers or pomanders to ward off disease. None of this helped, but doing something felt better than doing nothing. Doctors were helpless. Medieval medicine had no effective treatments. They tried bloodletting. They prescribed herbal remedies. They opened buboes, thinking draining them would help. Nothing worked. Doctors died alongside their patients. The medical profession was powerless. The economic impact was immediate. Labor shortages developed as workers died. Fields went unplanted. Shops closed. Trade disrupted. Those who survived found they could demand higher wages. When labor is scarce, workers have leverage. The social order began to shift. The plague returned in waves. The first outbreak in 1348-1349 was the worst. But it came back in 1361, and 1369, and 1375. Each time, more people died. Populations couldn't recover before the next wave hit. For decades, Europe lived under the shadow of recurring plague. The psychological impact was profound. How do you make plans when death seems random and inevitable? Some people became more religious, seeking salvation before it was too late. Others became hedonistic, embracing pleasure since tomorrow might not come. Both responses made sense. The plague broke normal patterns of thought and behavior. Paris was permanently changed. The city that emerged after the plague was smaller, poorer, more cautious. Neighborhoods that had bustled stood partially empty. Buildings deteriorated without occupants to maintain them. The confidence of the earlier medieval period was gone. Paris had been reminded that it was fragile. But it survived. The people who lived through the plague rebuilt. Slowly, gradually, Paris recovered. New families moved into empty houses. Businesses reopened. Trade resumed. Life, persistent and stubborn, continued. The locals who survived carried memories of what they'd witnessed. Entire families lost. Streets filled with corpses. The smell of death permeating everything. These were traumas that shaped a generation. But they also proved something. That even in the face of catastrophe, humans endure. That cities can be wounded and still survive. That life finds a way forward. By the late 1300s and into the 1400s, medieval Paris was beginning to change. The city that locals knew was slowly disappearing. The 100 Years' War brought instability. English armies threatened the region repeatedly. Paris itself was occupied by English forces from 1420 to 1436. Foreign soldiers in the streets. Residents having to accommodate an occupying power. When the English were finally expelled, Paris had changed. Confidence was shaken. The sense of invulnerability was gone. The late medieval period saw new technologies emerging. Printing arrived in Paris in the 1470s. The first printing press in the city was established at the Sorbonne. Suddenly, books could be produced in quantity. Information could spread faster than ever before. This would transform education, religion, politics. The world of hand-copied manuscripts was ending. Architectural styles were changing. The late Gothic buildings going up had different proportions than earlier medieval structures. More decoration, more delicate stonework, a sense of refinement that earlier periods lacked. And beyond the horizon, the Renaissance was beginning in Italy. New ideas about art, architecture, and humanity itself. These ideas would eventually reach Paris and transform it again. The population was recovering from the plague, but slowly. Paris never returned to its pre-plague size during the medieval period. Empty buildings dotted the city. Some neighborhoods had more abandoned houses than occupied ones. The city felt less crowded. There was space now, space that had been bought with countless deaths. Social structures were loosening. The old feudal order was breaking down. Peasants who had survived the plague could demand better wages and conditions. Serfs were buying their freedom. The nobility's power was no longer absolute. These changes would take centuries to fully unfold. But the process had begun. The university was becoming more formalized. Colleges were established to house and educate students. The Sorbonne, founded in the 1200s, was now a major institution. Other colleges followed. The informal arrangement of students studying under individual masters was giving way to structured programs. Education was becoming institutional. Fashion was changing. The clothing styles of the 1400s looked different from those of the 1200s. More elaborate, more individualized. Sumptuary laws tried to control who could wear what, but they were increasingly ignored. People were expressing themselves through clothing in new ways. The late medieval period also saw more skepticism about religious authority. The Great Schism, when rival popes claimed leadership, damaged the Church's credibility. People still believed, still practiced their faith. But there was more questioning, more doubt. The absolute authority the Church had held was weakening. Old traditions were fading. The guild system, though still powerful, was being challenged. Some craftsmen worked outside the guilds, finding ways to avoid their regulations. The market economy was becoming more complex, more flexible. The rigid structures of high medieval society were loosening. People noticed these changes. Older residents talked about how things used to be, how the streets were more orderly, how young people were more respectful, how standards were declining. Every generation thinks the world is declining. But in late medieval Paris, they were partly right. Their world was ending. The medieval Paris that had emerged slowly over 1,000 years was reaching its culmination. It would persist for another century or so. But the forces that would transform it were already present. Printing, new ideas, changing social structures, weakening traditions. The Renaissance was coming. The modern world was beginning. The locals who lived through this transition period inhabited a world between two eras, still medieval in most ways, but with glimpses of what was coming. They couldn't see the full transformation ahead. They just knew that things felt different, that the old certainties were less certain, that change was in the air. They were right. Though they couldn't know it, they were living in the twilight of the medieval world. The Paris they knew, the Paris of narrow streets and church bells and guild regulations, was beginning its long fade into history. If you visit Paris today, you can still find traces of the medieval city. But you have to look carefully. Notre-Dame still stands, though scarred by fire and time. The cathedral that took 200 years to build has survived nearly 900 years. It has witnessed kings crowned and revolutions fought. It burned in 2019 and will be rebuilt. Again, Notre Dame endures. Sainte-Chapelle remains on the Asile de la Cité copyright. Its stained glass still fills the chapel with colored light. Stand inside on a sunny day and you can see what medieval Parisians saw. That experience of light and color and sacred space. It hasn't changed. A few sections of Philip Augustus's walls survive. In the Marais, you can find remnants of the fortifications. Ancient stone partially hidden by later construction. Most of the walls were torn down centuries ago. But fragments remain, reminders that Paris was once a walled city. Some streets follow medieval paths. The street plan in the oldest parts of Paris preserves the medieval layout. Those twisting lanes that seem to have no logic. They're following routes laid down 1,000 years ago. Baron Haussmann destroyed much when he modernized Paris in the 1800s. But he couldn't erase everything. A handful of buildings survive from the medieval period. Not many. The timber structures burned or decayed. But some stone buildings remain. The HA with tilde tell the senators. The HA with tilde tell de Cluny. These medieval town houses give a sense of how the wealthy lived. How their private worlds were organized. Walk through them and you can almost hear the medieval city. But most of medieval Paris is gone. The bridges with houses on them. Demolished. The Grand Pont and Petit Pont are still there, but they're modern structures. No buildings. No shops. Just bridges connecting banks. The covered streets over water disappeared in the 1700s. Les Halles, the great medieval market, was torn down in 1971. Replaced with a modern shopping center. The area still exists, but the medieval market halls are gone. The vendors calling their wares. The smells of fish and bread. The crowds pressing together. All vanished. The maze of tiny streets. Mostly gone. Haussmann's boulevards cut through medieval neighborhoods like knives. Broad straight avenues replaced organic tangles. Thousands of buildings were demolished. Entire districts erased. The city was rationalized, modernized, opened up. The medieval labyrinth largely disappeared. The walls. Gone. Paris no longer needs walls. The city sprawls far beyond where any medieval fortification stood. The gates don't close at sunset. There's no inside and outside anymore. Just the endless urban expanse. The sounds. All different. You don't hear church bells marking every hour anymore. The grinding of water mills. The cries of street vendors. The animals in the streets. Modern Paris sounds nothing like medieval Paris. Traffic. Sirens. The hum of electricity. A completely different soundscape. The smells. Also gone. Medieval Paris had powerful odors. Sewage. Smoke. Animals. Unwashed bodies. Baking bread. Leather tanning. Modern Paris, with its sewers and sanitation, smells clean by comparison. Or at least different. The darkness. Perhaps the most profound change. Paris never goes dark now. Street lights. Building lights. Traffic lights. Lit signs and screens. The city glows. Night is no longer dark. You can walk anywhere at any hour and see clearly. Medieval Parisians would find this miraculous and perhaps unsettling. What remains, then, beyond the few physical structures? The Seine remains. The river that was everything to medieval Paris still flows. It's controlled now, channeled, bridged by dozens of crossings. But it's the same river, the same water, and it still defines the city's shape. The island remains. The Asile de la Cité copyright, where it all began. Notre-Dame still stands there. Sainte-Chapelle. The Palais de Justice on the site of the old royal palace. The island is still the heart of Paris. That hasn't changed in 1500 years. And something less tangible remains. Paris's identity. The sense that this is a city with deep history. That these streets have been walked for centuries. That countless lives have unfolded here. Modern Paris is built on medieval Paris, which was built on Roman Lutetia, which was built on the Celtic settlement. Layer upon layer of human habitation. All those lives, all those choices, all that persistence. You are connected to this history, even if you've never been to Paris. The medieval city influenced the world you live in. The university model, Gothic architecture, urban planning even in reaction against the medieval approach. The idea of citizenship, the concept of public space, all shaped by places like medieval Paris. The locals who walked those vanished streets are gone. Their voices silent, their daily concerns forgotten. But they built something that lasted. Not the physical structures, most of those are gone. But the city itself, the idea of Paris, that persists, that endures. We've walked together through centuries tonight, through the small island fortress that became a great city. We've watched Notre-Dame rise stone by stone, navigated the maze of medieval streets, felt the river's rhythm organizing daily life, witnessed markets bustle and universities debate, experienced the absolute darkness of medieval nights, and seen how plague and war and time changed everything. The Paris those locals knew is gone. The sounds, the smells, the textures of daily life, all vanished. But the foundation remains. That island in the river, the Seine still flowing, the cathedral still standing, wounded but enduring. The spirit of a place that has survived everything history could throw at it. Every city has layers. Every place you walk has been walked before. Countless feet on the same ground. Countless eyes seeing different versions of the same spaces. History is not just dates and events. It's people living, working, loving, building, surviving, leaving behind more than they knew. Those medieval Parisians didn't know they were medieval. They were just living their lives. They thought their Paris was permanent, that the streets they walked would always be there, that their world would continue unchanged. They were wrong. Everything changed. But they were also right, because something of what they built remains. In fragments, in memory, in the shape of the city that grew from their foundation. Let yourself rest now. Let these images settle like dust after a long journey. The island, the bridges, the cathedral rising, the river flowing. All of it distant now, all of it peaceful, history at rest. You have walked through a world that no longer exists, but for a few hours tonight it lived again. In words, in imagination, in the quiet space between waking and sleep. That Paris, the Paris locals saw before it disappeared, has kept you company. Now let it go. Let the medieval city fade back into time. Let your breathing slow. Let your mind drift. You are here, now, safe and still. While somewhere in memory, church bells ring across an island in a river. While somewhere in the past, a city full of voices goes quiet. While somewhere beyond time, medieval Paris rests. And you can rest too. Sleep well. Dream of cathedrals rising, of rivers flowing, of ancient stones holding stories. Dream of a city that was, and in its own way still is. Good night.